When does a phenomenon become the unknown? When all attempts at understanding fail, and those who thirst for knowledge and understanding watch as research turns to ash in their mouth, as the phenomenon turns from a riddle to be solved into anomalous fascination. Hello, friends. Thank you for tuning in to episode 8 of the Anomalous Fascination podcast. After 7 episodes of this show, it occurs to me I've never properly introduced myself to those of you who may not know me. My name is Andy Clodfelter, and it has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you the past few weeks. I'd like to thank you all again for your amazing feedback and support over previous episodes. It means a lot. Please feel free to contact me anytime with feedback, suggestions, or even just to say hey. As I always say, if you love the show, tell a friend about it. Because who doesn't want to hear the stories that history and science textbooks never taught us? And now, on with the show. I'd like to start this episode off with a question to our friends in the northern US and Canada. Don't worry, Southern fans, we'll get back to you soon. What are your least favorite months of the year? Sure, many will throw out a hot summer month or maybe even a boring month. Looking at you, September. But I have a feeling that a good amount of you would say January and February. At least I know I would. The holiday season has ended. It's light out for roughly 4 hours a day. Everything is gray and dead outside, and most importantly, it is so unbelievably cold. As someone who lives in Illinois, I can say with absolute certainty that I do not have it the worst. But still, there is a reason why I say winter is the worst season. Because, to quote myself, I prefer the months where you won't potentially die from sitting outside too long. By the time spring hits every year, we often promise ourselves that this is the year we're going to move south. But then suddenly, it's October again and you did it. You forgot to move. Now imagine how cold it gets where you're from. And then make it worse. Because that is where we'll be starting our story for today. Aside from Alaska and some parts of North Dakota, Minnesota is about as cold as you can get in the US. And no, I'm not talking about Minneapolis or even Duluth. We'll be starting our story in the village of Lyngby, Minnesota. Population of 86 in the 2010 census. This town is nearly 4.5 hours north by northwest of Minneapolis and about 3.5 hours west by northwest of Duluth. As we learned in episode 7, sometimes the most interesting things can happen in the most unassuming places. And although the beginning of this story may not surprise you, as it involves cold temperatures and desolate places, what happens next defies explanation. Let's take a stroll, shall we? It was December 20th, 1980, in Lyngby, Minnesota. Technically not even winter yet by our calendars, but given the events to come, I doubt you'll feel that way soon. A 19-year-old woman by the name of Jean Hilliard had driven into town from her home to visit with some friends that evening. After a night full of fun with her friends at the American Legion, she set off to town to go home around midnight. She lived with her parents at the time and was driving her father's Ford LTD with rear-wheel drive and, of course, no anti-lock brakes. Jean knew a shortcut home, and despite the snow and ice, which are a given during the winter months, she took the icy gravel road after leaving town. As she traveled down this small road off the beaten path after midnight, she began to lose control of her vehicle and ended up stuck in a ditch beside the road. Realizing the situation she was in, with it being highly unlikely any traffic would pass by this hour on this road, she stayed calm and made a decision. She knew a man who lived down the road from where she was, so she figured she would walk the distance easily enough. So she got out of her car, grabbed mittens and a jacket, and headed out. Unfortunately, Hilliard likely did not expect to be doing any long-distance traversing through the cold, as she was wearing cowboy boots from the evening's gathering, so not great. Oh, what was the temperature that night? -22 degrees Fahrenheit, or -30 degrees Celsius. As she traveled, she would find hill after hill on the horizon, and every time she was about to crest a hill, she would think, "This is the one. His house is right over this hill." But every time she was left disappointed. Finally, after 2 miles, she crested a hill, and there it was, her friend's home. I can't even imagine what a sight that had to have been. Jean continued walking with desperation towards the house, each step more laborious than the last, as she tripped and began crawling her way through the snow towards the house. When suddenly, her vision went black, and she lost consciousness. We would later find out that she made it within 15 feet of the front door. So, real bummer of a story, huh? Seems strange that I would bring it up as a topic? Just kidding, you know very well that is not the end of this story. It was about 7 a.m. the following morning when Wally Nelson woke up next to a woman he had brought home from the night before. You do you, Wally. He got up out of bed and was walking around his house when he looked out one of his windows and noticed a strange lump sitting atop his snow-covered lawn, not too far from the front entrance. He quickly made his way outside to discover the body of Jean Hilliard, frozen solid. Wally immediately knew who this was, as Jean had been dating a best friend of his at the time. He quickly grabbed her by the collar and dragged her up onto the porch. Nelson stated, quote, "She was froze stiffer than a board, but I saw a few bubbles coming out of her nose." End quote. Wally quickly grabbed the woman he had had over the night before, and they carried the body out to her car because it was so stiff it wouldn't fit in his truck's cab. Not knowing what to do, they drove the body about 10 minutes to the nearest hospital, which was in Fosston, Minnesota. They grabbed assistance, and the doctors took it from there. Obviously, the doctors were not optimistic, to say the least, as they began examining the body and attempting to run tests, all of which failed. For example, the attempt to get a needle in her arm was fruitless as it broke on contact with her frozen skin. Then, while attempting to take her temperature, they got no result as her body temperature was below what standard thermometers could detect. Additionally, there was no pulse due to how frozen she was, and her eyes were not responding to light. The doctors at this point assumed she was dead, but had to at least thaw her out to confirm, as they began warming her up with numerous heating pads. After a while of thawing, the doctors attempted a few tests again with the skin thawed a bit, and were able to finally get a reading that her body temperature was around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 18 degrees less than normal body temperature. She had a heart rate of roughly 12 beats per minute, and they even detected shallow breathing of about 2 to 3 times a minute, which led doctors to believe that she might just live. Suddenly, a few minutes after they started receiving readings, Jean started going into violent convulsions. Bad news, right? One would think, but shortly after these convulsions, after around 8+ hours of being completely frozen and unconscious, Jean regained consciousness in the hospital bed. And very shortly after, she was not only awake, but all of her mental faculties were completely fine. Once she was completely coherent, it came time to assess the damage done to her body. As doctors suspected, they may have to amputate both legs to avoid infection from the frostbite. Upon assessments with her body now warmed up, the doctors made a shocking discovery. After 6 hours of lying unconscious in negative 22-degree weather, despite all odds, she left the hospital with nothing more than a few spots of frostbites on her toes that were easily treated. Her case became known as, quote, the miracle on ice. Which, if you're thinking, isn't that the incredible US versus Russian hockey game? Yes, in fact, it occurred only 6 months before this incident, so I suspect it was a clever wordplay at the time. So, we've covered the story of Jean Hilliard, but the question is this: is this situation impossible or improbable? Had there not been more incidences of extremely frozen people brought back from the brink? Yes, there have been, which is what we'll discuss after this short break, and more importantly, the truly unexplainable part of this and so many other cases like it. Stories like this are rare, and this one in particular was notable due to her walking away with barely a scratch, and the fact that it occurred before the introduction of crucial technology that allows doctors to pump the patient's blood through a heater to warm their vital organs from the inside. But as I mentioned, they do still happen. For example, Justin Smith in 2015, who faced a similar situation of losing consciousness in negative 4-degree weather for 8 hours. But his recovery was a bit more complicated, as at one point he had no brain function detectable by machines, and both his lungs and kidneys were not functioning. Despite all of this, he awoke, and aside from amputations of some toes and some physical therapy, he was back to normal and living his life a month later. So, if this situation itself isn't unprecedented, and has happened numerous times since, what's so unexplainable about this? Well, it's less so the events themselves, which, don't get me wrong, are absolutely unbelievable, but rather the process that allows people to live through this. The body slows everything down immensely, and even shuts down many non-essential functions. It is so minimalized that no one would be able to tell that that person is alive. You might be familiar with this process, but not with humans. You may call it hibernation in regards to many animals out in the wild, but its true name is suspended animation. And it's being studied more than you would ever believe. Despite scientists working backwards and determining that they can put a human in a state of suspended animation via hypothermia, shockingly most folks are not too keen on a process that doesn't last very long and has a risk of brain damage. To this day, scientists cannot figure out what so many animals in nature just naturally have at their disposal: a safe and easy method of inducing a hibernation state. Being able to achieve this in humans would save the lives of so many seriously ill or injured patients, who would be suspended until treatment can be given. Naturally, I suspect if this is ever achieved that there will be some less heroic uses for it. Maybe a money saver for snowbirds. For those of you who don't know, those are older folks who travel south for the winter. Allowing them to instead hibernate away those months, rather than renting a place in Gulf Shores every year. I'm joking, but only kind of. Scientists are currently still working on new chemical methods of inducing this, and it seems the testing is looking more and more promising every year. So maybe someday in the future, you and I can call off work in our least favorite months of the year, and take the nap to end all naps, to leave January and February in our rearview mirrors. Or for those of you who said September, you can finally do your best Billy Joe Armstrong impression, and say, "Wake me up when September ends." Thank you again for listening to this episode of Anomalous Fascination. If you'd like to keep in touch with the show, you can find me at AnomalyPod on Twitter, or email me at anomalousfascination@gmail.com. And if you love the show, hop on Apple Podcasts and leave a nice 5-star rating and review for the show. Or even just tell a friend about it. And until next time, thanks for listening.